the moderator of Inside the Scav.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is going to be a really insightful event. My name's Aaron Masliansky. As Hillary mentioned, I host a podcast called Inside the Scav, and it's all about the people of Skokie and Evanston, Illinois, and some really interesting stories. And but tonight I am truly delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Rachel Fisher and Rachel Pasternak, and we're going to talk about their film, Joachim Prinz, I Shall Not Be Silent. Prince was a leader of the civil rights movement. He worked to organize the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, declaring bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. Moments later, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Tonight, we're going to discuss the film with the producers and answer any questions that you may have in the audience. So before we get started, just a reminder, you could submit questions via the chat box. So please type your questions there, and we'll do our best to get to everybody's questions in the time that we have allotted. But Rachel, I so much appreciate you both being here tonight to talk about your film. And, you know, this whole Film Fest, this series is about social justice and the connection between the Jewish community to the Black community and the fight for social justice and civil rights. And, you know, you made this film a few years ago, but my God, it is a poignant film for today. And we could talk about that a little bit later on. But at the beginning, what gave you the inspiration to focus on Rabbi Dr. Prinz and create this film?
Should I go, Rach? Okay. Thank you so much, Aaron. What gave us the inspiration to make the film was when I was in graduate school at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan. I was introduced to his family because my grandparents knew Rabbi Prince very well, and I was introduced. He had since passed away, but I was introduced to his daughter and encouraged to do a paper about him. And I found in her basement were boxes. At the time, his materials had not yet been cataloged and were not in Cincinnati at HUC as they are now. So I came across his unpublished memoir, and I read it, you know, in one sitting. It was a couple hundred pages, and I had been as I said, in graduate school at the seminary. I was a 10-year graduate I had attended Jewish day school for 10 years. Yeah. And I was like, he's not been in the history books. Like, this man needs to be, his story needs to be told. I just felt like he was such a hero in so many different ways. And I had this dream that he would, especially students would learn about his legacy. I thought he was such a wonderful example.
Why do you think he wasn't in the history books?
Do you want to take that, Rach?
Sure. We have a couple sort of hypotheses. First of all, you know, Rabbi Prince lived for about 10 years after he retired. He, you know, lived another 10, 15 years. And for part of that time, he had pretty severe dementia and was really out of the public eye. So the last like 10 years of his life, he was out of the public eye. And, you know, in terms of the civil rights movement, we're learning now about so many figures who were really important in the civil rights movement, whose stories weren't told because there was sort of a singular narrative of the civil rights movement focusing on Martin Luther King, who absolutely, you know, earned and deserves all of the honor that he's given, but perhaps a somewhat oversimplified narrative developed, which didn't look at all of the people standing around Martin Luther King quite as much. And now that more time has passed, there's time for people like us and people who, you know, there was a film made about Bayard Rustin. People are now focusing more on a lot of the women who were civil rights organizers. So there are still even more stories that haven't been told from that period. And then finally, you know, Rabbi Prince had a somewhat complicated relationship with sort of mainstream Jewish organizations because he was such an iconoclast, and particularly his outspokenness on peace in Israel, which, you know, we tell that story in the latter part of the film. So because there were so many people who perhaps hadn't agreed with him, you know, those folks were not necessarily in a big rush to, you know, sort of canonize him.
Yeah, and I would just add also that B'nai Abraham was not affiliated. It wasn't officially a Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, or Reconstruction. So he didn't have that in terms of the Jewish world by itself. They weren't affiliated. So that's another way, right? That like people in the community, especially back then, they were very much about joining. You know, they were very much members of a Jewish community, and so he was such an independent figure, as Rachel's saying. In addition to that, his literal synagogue was not affiliated with a movement. So that was yet another reason that when he passed, it's up to, you know, people to bring back the pieces, right, of someone's story.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I did wonder about that, if he was, you know, part of conservative or reform or traditional or whatever it may be. But I think for him, for how independent he was, and you show this at the beginning of the film, how when he's growing up in Germany, he's not your typical rabbi. He's your fun rabbi. He's the guy who can relate to everybody. He's the orator. He's the one who can inspire people. And he was so effective in Germany. What do you think gave him that type of personality and the resilience to deal with the Nazis and not get killed?
Oh, well, I mean, to begin with, from such a young age, I remember reading in his biography that when he was little, he loved to be, you know, he had dreams of standing in front of crowds, and he would play his violin and perform in front of people. So he just, you know, as you know, if you have kids, like sometimes they pop out that way. So I think he always liked to be at the center of attention. And when you use the word resilience, I think of he had a somewhat fractured, like a difficult relationship with his father. So I think that and losing his mother at a very young age, and they were so close that I think he was just in his nature very strong. And then he also became stronger because he, you know, was standing up to his father over and over again. His choice to become a rabbi was a rebellion within the family. They had lived in Germany for like 500 years, as we say in the film, and his father was a complete German patriot and a business owner, and they did not go to synagogue. So I think those pieces of him were like always there. And then he was someone who was so passionate and loved so deeply, cared so deeply. And he had lost his mom young. He lost his first wife young. And I think sometimes those losses help you to become a bit fearless as well. So, when the situation was changing in Germany, you know, he had grown up, they were the only Jews in the town for many years. He went to church with his Christian nannies. He felt like he was German until he could literally smell that he wasn't, like, and because of who he was and because of his family history and all that, he was, as I explained, able to be fearless in speaking. And it was that time as well that his message was so resonant.
I just want to add too that I think that Rabbi Prince shared with Martin Luther King and John Lewis and many other leaders, you know, the spiritual strength and the belief that, yes, he liked to be the center of attention, but it wasn't for egotistical reasons. It was to carry a message, whether it was, you know, carrying the message of art, playing the violin, or carrying, you know, the message of the prophets. So I think that also makes you fearless because you are part of something that's bigger than you. And in a way, you're important because you have this charisma and this skill, but in a way you also don't matter, right? Because it's the message that matters. So if something happens to you, that's not really the biggest consideration, right, in that moment.
Right. He felt like he had a larger obligation to humanity than himself.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
could see, though, his fearlessness when he was in his synagogue in Germany, and there are people vandalizing the place while the congregation is there. And he just walked up to them and said, "Can I help you?" I mean, the guts that takes, it's not even guts. It's just like complete lack of death, fear of death in a way. And
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Well, I was just
I-
gonna say, that reminded me, because also in his memoirs, I remember him talking about how he psychologically, like, he would make sure to like look in the eyes of the Gestapo, like when he was called to their office, or and I think he just had this such confidence. He did have like amazing confidence, and like Rachel was saying, believed so strongly in his message and what his purpose was. And then he was also really socially adept. So I think he had great confidence in that he'd be okay, even though you can't really know that you'd be, but.
Right. I mean, how many people were in his congregation in Germany? I mean, maybe he had the help in the numbers, I guess.
Yeah, well, the way it worked actually in Berlin at the time was that the rabbis would go around to the different synagogues. So you didn't have a congregation per se. It would be like, oh, Prince is speaking at this one for the next 3 weeks, and then 3 weeks after that going to a different one. And people would actually follow you, from synagogue to synagogue if they wanted to hear you.
But he did have a big audience, like you're saying, like there
Yes,
were people.
He had
around.
a big following. Yes, he had a big following for sure.
I'm sure that translated into his success in the United States and bringing Martin Luther King Jr. to come to speak at his synagogue, which definitely must have been controversial. And I think you touch on that in the film as well. But he had no fear of, I mean, some people may think, well, he wanted the attention, but really, like you said, it was about not at all. It was about the message. And for him to let Martin Luther King Jr. come to speak at his place really shows you that he was more just about getting out the right message, the positive message that was needed to be heard by the people in his congregation.
Yeah, that was actually Martin Luther King Jr. Coming wasn't like a big glamorous, it wasn't like a gala. It was part of a monthly lecture series, or I don't know how often, but my grandfather
Would have loved to have gone.
What's that?
I would have loved to have gotten the
Yeah, I mean,
opportunity.
they had Cesar Chavez there. Like he brought political, people there who were controversial. So, because one of his lines was, I detest uniformity of thought. I love a controversial discussion. So I'm sure they brought people there that would engage and, really that would be educational, but also enlightening and maybe enraging sometimes.
Yeah. Was there any pushback from, the people who were following Martin Luther King Jr. or just the Black community in general to having the participation of, a rabbi or the Jewish community within the civil rights movement at that time?
I don't believe at the beginning, no. I mean, I think Prince, as far as we can see, Prince met Martin Luther King in 1958. They may have met earlier, but in terms of what we could find historical evidence for. And I think at that point, King and the other people in the movement were absolutely looking for allies and, were very, very glad to have the support. Obviously, later in the civil rights movement, post after the March on Washington, sort of 1967, that's when you start getting, more of the Black nationalist movement, and you get that internal struggle within the larger Black liberation movement. And there it was really a question of who's going to be in leadership positions and making sure that, Black people were in leadership positions. And that's, famously, of course, John Lewis, that's when he resigned from SNCC. So that was something that happened later. But I think at the beginning and through a large part of the movement, no, I think the more the better. I mean, I have a good friend here in Maplewood who's active in our local Black Lives Matter activism, who says, we can't do this by ourselves. You know, we're a minority. We can't do this by ourselves. And I think that's how they felt.
How did he, but, you know, part of it's trust. How did he build that trust, you know, with other communities within the Jewish community to, you know, put himself out there completely to make these positive changes?
What do you mean building?
Well, I mean, I think that sometimes, you know, there must have been some, maybe not at the beginning, but as time went on, as you speak about it, I mean, there must have been some hesitation of who's really an ally. What are people really out there to, what are they looking to gain? But really from what he was looking at it from his perspective, I believe from the film that I gather, that his whole point was for freedom, that you know, you talk about neighbor isn't a geographic term. Like, he just really believed in the good of humanity, but some people might be looking for fame or power or something else within that. You know, there are probably FBI agents who were involved in trying to get into different movements to be able to, you know, work whatever angle there was.
Right.
But how did he build trust?
I think that there's a couple different things. I mean, obviously showing up is important. And I also think that when people saw him sometimes getting pushback from within his own community, that's how you know you have a real ally, is if somebody is willing to take criticism and still doesn't change their positions. So I think that was part of it too.
Yeah, and I would say, I think you can tell when someone's authentic and speaking from their heart. And it wasn't just like he had this idea in freedom, which he did, but that was born of something so deep within inside him when he saw what happened in his country and in Germany. And then when he was here, he was willing to do whatever he could to not have that happen, you know, because this was like, other than Israel, this was, you know, the best place to be. Then this was the best. This is where they picked up and moved, and they were immigrants, you know. So that was a lot to fight for. And I think he was consistent with his efforts. As you could see, he was right. I mean, he was like, you know, he had a track record, and he was speaking from his heart, and he was very, very smart. And congregants told us over and again what a wonderful rabbi he was too. Like, he showed up for them. He showed up on the big time, and he showed up, you know, when you were in the hospital.
They showed up to your birthday party.
Yeah, exactly. There's that saying, if you've come here to help me, I don't want your help. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And, you know, Rabbi Prince definitely felt that the survival of the Jewish people, the liberation of the Jewish people, the removal of oppression for the Jewish people depended on the removal of oppression for everyone. And people could tell that about him. So you're not really just trying to help somebody else. You're really fighting for yourself.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, you're tying your bigger reason for being with that of the greater good in many ways. Yeah. Who do you think is kind of his successor in this type of role, like in today's world? Do you see anyone who is?
I think it's such a different time that in some ways we're all called to be that person. You know, we're all called to be Rabbi Prince. I mean, I keep thinking about this, and we've been asked it before, like, communication has changed like 1,000,000%, right? So, I mean, it was pretty radical that at the March on Washington in 1963, he just like ad hoc, that was like basically kind of like a long tweet, right? Like he like quickly gave a speech, like, but otherwise it took a lot of thought. Like every time you want to sit down and write a letter, you sat at the typewriter, and that was the process. So anyway, my point is that so many people are sharing the microphone now, but I think there are some organizations that are doing really great work. So I would look in that sense. I feel like people at certain organizations, in addition to, you're right, like there's such a platform now for so many, right, that, so in that sense, it's because the Jewish world is so, and in general, people, as you know, are not affiliated as they were then. So, and I don't think that people are looking necessarily for a hero in that way. You know what I mean? Like it's just, we don't have the same hierarchy. And I think rabbis, for example, are much more personable, and people are not necessarily looking for a rabbi to be on a platform anymore. I think that, yeah. So I think that we all have to look and how can we be like Rabbi Prince,
Yeah. Well, it's very, I guess, broken down, like you said, like where everybody can have a platform to say something in many ways, Twitter or any Facebook or anything. And that's a little bit kind of the harder part about kind of corralling a message, because everybody's got their own platform and there's not as much of leadership in many ways. But I think that what he did can be an inspiration for good. I mean, were there people like, is his family still involved in anything with the missions that he worked on, or his congregation?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, his daughter, who's in the film, is very involved in social justice and in interfaith work. And what would you say? What is the organization? It's like,
well, she works with an interfaith environmental group.
Right.
Deborah does.
Yeah, and his son his son writes extensively. He has a blog, so he's very outspoken. I think they're definitely like, they're not afraid to speak their mind, like for sure. And then they've both been leaders in their own ways. Like, Jonathan as a writer, and Deborah at the school she was affiliated with for many years, and in her other volunteer work. And then actually, interestingly, his grandchildren, like one of his grandchildren was like the national leader for Young Judea and like a huge Zionist. And then one of his grandsons, Rachel, is at a screening with him. He's a professor at a New York University.
So he really passed on to the generations.
And now actually his congregation within the last year, because I think it's hard to follow someone like a Rabbi Prince. So the rabbis, the Rabbi Clifford Coolwin, who was a couple rabbis removed from Rabbi Prince, was the one who thought, wow, he was an amazing human being. We have to catalog his papers. So that was the start. He discovered, he realized like, we need to like get Rabbi Prince's message in one place and all his work. And then he was helpful in having his memoirs published. So in terms of that, and now the current rabbi at Rabbi Prince's synagogue, I haven't met him yet, but I read that like he chose that pulpit. One of the main reasons is because he was so influenced by Rabbi Prince's work. And so now I think they have like maybe a young Rabbi Prince, someone who's really been influenced and moved by his work is now the rabbi at that temple.
That's really beautiful. I mean, some of the inspirational people that I think are passed down from him were on your advisory committee for the film. What was it like working with some of the people like his daughter or other, Senator Booker you had? What was that like, and what kind of information did they give you to help you with the film?
Well, I want to give some more credit again to Rabbi Coolwin, who, as Rachel said, sort of was the one who really, I think, affirmed for the family that their father's legacy was significant and that they needed to preserve his story and preserve his papers.
And he's a historian, so.
Right, and he's a historian, and he's done a lot of writing about Rabbi Prince. And he writes a lot of op-eds and things like that. So it was great working with him. And Rabbi Colwyn was the person who had a relationship with Cory Booker. Because Rabbi Colwyn, again, sort of taking the legacy of Prince and B'nai Abraham very seriously, had done some really good work with what you might call the Newark diaspora, like all of these Jews who had moved out to the suburbs outside of Newark. Rabbi Colwyn had done some really good work reconnecting with the city and helping people try to support the work that Cory Booker was doing in trying to, sort of revive the city and support the citizens there. Yeah. So we met Cory Booker through Rabbi Colwyn. And Cory Booker's probably biggest contribution, in addition to us being able to interview him, was giving us our name of R squared when we met him.
Really?
So he just jokingly said, "Oh, Rachel and Rachel, R squared." So as you can imagine, we didn't get a lot of his time.
But he was at a screening actually at B'nai Abraham.
Yes, and he talks about Rabbi Prince a lot.
I mean, it's worth noting that the evening that Rachel is referring to with Cory Booker, that's also in the film, and that is when the synagogue, B'nai Abraham, that's now a church in Newark, was given national landmark status. So that it was an event around that. Again, which is an example of Rabbi Colwyn's commitment to Newark, as well as Deborah Prince's, that was able to happen. So that was a great evening, because members of that congregation that hadn't been there in so many years came back down to Newark, even though only 15 or 20 minutes away from where they live, but they hadn't been there. So yeah, it was a real return. And
well, it's typical of many American cities where, groups of people migrate to different neighborhoods, and then you haven't been there in, a long time. I know here in Chicago, where I am, my mom's whole family was on the west side of Chicago, and now there's tours to go see the old synagogues, which are now churches.
Exactly.
And they haven't been there in years. So it's important to recognize the history and the connections that we all have within the geographic metropolitan areas that we live in. But you got some tremendous archives. I mean, a lot of the footage that you pulled was from maybe the 1950s and 1960s, different interviews, and you had some new ones. How were you able to tie that all together where you can kind of see where you can tie in the old footage and then immediately to something, newer, with like when you had, John Lewis speaking, but then there's images of him being beaten during a protest.
It's really painstaking. I mean, we had great editors, and we worked with them and we drove them crazy. We spent a lot of time, just painstaking, go back 2 seconds, go back, 0.2 of a second. I think we need to cut it here. And it's very painstaking. But
and then
for the footage, I was just going to say, for us, the footage, at least for me, Rachel, I'll let you speak for yourself. I don't know if you felt the same way, but even now when I see the film, the footage is my favorite part by far. I mean, and you see new things in it. Every time you watch it, you see new things in the footage. So we felt like it was important to really use as much of that as we could. And we tried to do as little narration as possible. So we just put the narration in when we felt like it was absolutely necessary. But we tried to really tell the story through the footage and the interviews.
And and Rabbi Prince, we did searches within, to find out footage, to track him, to see how often. I mean, he was in the New York Times regularly, and then we hired professionals to dig up the archival information as well. So we had, different people helping us tell the best story.
Well, it really flowed through. It's I thought it was terrific how to learn about it, because I honestly, I didn't really know much about him. I knew that there were Jews that were involved in the civil rights movement, and I heard about different things over the years, but never in depth. And I think that's really important, because sometimes today you don't realize the strong connections between different communities within America, especially within the Jewish community, and what are, the things that the values that we get from our heritage. And it's important to kind of imbue yourself with that and realize and be proud of it and use it to work towards something that is for the greater good. One question I have is, since you know so much about Rabbi Prince, what do you think his response would be today? I mean, right now with social justice, with how the world is dealing with a pandemic, how would he inspire us?
You want me to go first, Rach, since you're thinking, or do you want to go first? I'm good either way.
Well, you can go, because I don't know what I'm going to say. So go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure either, really. I always have a hard time with that, because I always want to make sure that I don't just put my own words in, Rabbi Prince's mouth and say, oh, well, he would think everything that I think, because he's not here. But I think that, Rabbi Prince was very wary of anything that threatened democracy. And I think that he would be very alarmed at, the state of our democracy. And I think he would absolutely be speaking out about it, just as many people are. Something I always remember from the film is when he talks about the soul and the moral health of the nation. And I think that's what he would be concerned about, is the moral health of the nation.
Yeah.
Do you think he'd be fighting for the moral health of the nation, or would he be telling people to leave?
I think he would be fighting for the moral health of the nation. I don't think he would be telling Jews to leave right now. Perhaps, America is such a big country. It's a different situation, and there are so many minorities that it's a different situation than in Germany. Mm-hmm. I think he would believe that if we all band together and we support each other, that we can get things going in the right direction.
That makes me hopeful.
I mean, I think that he would. It's hard to really answer it, but to answer it, I would just say, like, if he, let's say, for example, to picture him on his pulpit, to answer your question, if he was speaking from there, well, first of all, he'd be repeatedly talking about the 4-letter word vote. So right now, but going back for the last 4 years, he would just, I'm sure, his sermons were very political. So, he would be tying in our history with today and educating, informing and wanting people. He really wanted his congregants to be informed, so the first thing is really be informed about the political situation and do something about it, so that's the other thing. Voting and speaking out and writing letters or giving money, like however you can make your voice heard, and hopefully from an educated position, not out of fear.
Exactly. I was just about to say that. Yeah. Not
out of fear, but out of justice. And a yoga teacher that I admire very much said yesterday, and she's, very outspoken about many things, including, racial injustice and all that, said, love big, and it's not like love big, woohoo, what does that mean? No, really, like love humanity. Like that's what Rabbi Prince did, like what would love do in this day, mm-hmm. if we're all looking at each other like that. And it's not a time to be silent. So vote would be my last thing. Vote would be what he was saying.
You talk about how he would tell people to get educated and to know about things so they can vote and they could take action. One of the things that you have on your webpage for the movie is that you work with educators to, help schools teach about Rabbi Prinz, teach about, social justice, things of that nature. Have you worked with a lot of schools, and how do you do it now with, the current situation?
Well, you take that, Rach, because Rachel has done more of it recently.
I'm trying to think if there have been any school.
I think you did one in Summit, right? Or was it? Or was
Oh,
that?
well, there have been a bunch of schools that have shown the film and that we've done Q&As with, we've done workshops, but I don't think there's been one since the pandemic, since kids are home. I don't think we've done a lot of these virtual Q&As with adults. I don't think we've done a school one virtually. So the last one that I did was probably in February or something. Usually, January around Martin Luther King's birthday, Black History Month, that's when, schools will often show the film. And it's been a great experience whenever we can show it in schools. And I think students really appreciate knowing this history. And I think it inspires them and it makes them feel hopeful. So
it inspired me.
It's been great.
Yeah, and we had two little stories. One, it's not the direct answer to your question, but a couple of years back, we showed the film at a university here, and I guess he's a professor, right? One of the professors who was part of that and is involved in his own social justice work wrote to us a couple months ago that he and his wife just had a child, and they named the child Joachim.
Wow.
And then another story about the youth is that people we know in California, there was a screening of the film, and this young boy was so inspired by Rabbi Prince's story that I think he was tying Rabbi Prince's story into his mitzvah project, and really influenced and inspired by the story. And then finally, I would say, even though this was a while back, there was a wonderful screening at the Newark Museum of students, mostly African-American students, at that screening at the museum. And afterwards, they said, we didn't know that Blacks and Jews ever worked together. And that's been the case over and over again, that this enlightening and seeing like, wow, that could be too, like it was and it could be again,
Right. Well, I think I want to give a gratitude to the JCC for putting on this program to highlight the work that the Jewish community has done, and together to promote, freedom and social justice. And I think that I would hope that your film gets played into more classrooms during these times, because things can be done like this, and it'd be great for you to be able to speak to a group of students who can learn more about it. It's so important. Absolutely. The two of you have worked together on this, and you co-produce it. How did you, one of the questions from the audience is, how did you meet, and how did you divide up the work and get things out there?
We met because of the thoughtfulness of one person. Anyway, so I met this person, Rachel's friend, once, and we were both involved in history work, oral history work. And he said, you guys should meet. And so we met from, his name is Avram. We met through one person, and then we collaborated on one short film together. It wasn't an original film. It was called Remembering Ashvenshim. It was using footage from the Shoah, Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. And we were able to, we just really divided that work. There wasn't any, delineation, and you'll do this and you'll do that. And it's interesting, for this film, I think we just we didn't formally divide up, but there were things that I was, more inclined to be doing that were more suited for my personality. And Rachel has her PhD, I have a master's. Rachel is that much more into research. So Rachel was a bit more involved in the footage and that piece. And I would say I was more involved maybe in like some outreach and connecting with donors and things like that. But really we were both together in the room, in the editing room, alongside, the three editors. And the thing that we really shared is, I think we were so committed. Rachel and I both have a deep love of history and Jewish history and believe in the stories of people. We both learned that from our grandfathers. And once Rachel and I came upon the story, I think we knew we had to tell it, so that was the other piece. Like we were in it till the end,
Yeah.
We never thought we're not going to do it, or we didn't make this money,
Right. In the beginning, nobody believed in this project except for us. So we were already close, but that definitely bonds you.
Why is it so important for the two of you to tell stories?
I think our stories are everything. I mean, my grandfather, I credit him with that really, because he believed that we each have a story that can be told. And he taught me that because he would often write down on his typewriter, he'd type out what it was like when he was growing up, what it was like when he met my grandmother, so I really, and then I went on to become a journalist and captured people's stories, very much influenced by that. So I think that's how we learn, like when you said you didn't know about Rabbi Prince, it's like, how do we learn information? Like it's nowadays, our generation or you're younger, but movies, television, school, and then what our families tell us,
Right.
So if you have a captive audience when your kids, until they go to college, and a great deal of influence on them. So it's a missed opportunity not to share the stories of other generations of because I feel like, how do you get a perspective otherwise,
I agree. I feel like it's, just being connected to history connects you with the rest of humanity, and being connected to history and even the future is telling the stories.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And obviously we're a people of the book, and that's what the Torah is. It's a story. And I feel like, I oftentimes think about the people who heard those stories and passed them down orally, and then eventually somebody wrote it down. And I feel like, and then somebody else copied it, and I basically feel like that's what we're doing.
Yeah, in a graphic format. Have you worked on other films since?
I have been working on writing screenplays. So I wrote a screenplay about Rabbi Prince, and I'm working now on a script about Frances Perkins, who was the first female cabinet secretary in US history. She was FDR's labor secretary and was responsible for essentially the entire social safety net that we have now, including Social Security. So another story that is not told as much as it should be.
No, didn't know about that either.
Yeah, look her up.
I didn't either until,
So as she also actually, the reason I got involved with her is that she was really the only person in FDR's cabinet who tried to save Jewish refugees. And she was pretty much foiled at every turn, but she was not Jewish, but she was very close to the Jewish community, and she really tried to save refugees and was pretty much the only person doing that in the 30s that was in government. So that's how I got into her. So I've been telling stories that way since then. We have not made another film.
Yeah, I've been building. I do, committed work more around health and wellness. I think it's still about stories though, and still about, there's similarities to the film and what I'm doing now, but it's more focused on health and wellness. And making a film is a roller coaster, like unless it's like your day job for HBO or Showtime or Netflix. But for us, it was just it was a bit much about the fundraising as it was about the storytelling, and it was tricky to have kids at home and be doing that. So I think each of us now are, even as our kids have gotten older, just doing something that's maybe has a little bit more of a balance to it,
Right, because you're always trying to convince somebody that it makes sense. I mean, you both said that nobody else believed in it at the beginning. How did you ultimately get funding?
I mean, it took us 8 years to make the film because every time we wanted to do an interview, we had to raise the money to hire our director of photography. So it was through introductions of a lot of different people, through people we knew, through people the Prince family knew, and then people who believed in us through the synagogue. That, you know, and every time someone made a significant contribution that could take us to the next step, it was really pushed us to go to the next person, you know. And so Andre and Kelly Hunter were our biggest donors, and Andre's mother was very close to Rabbi Prince, and she had her own like fascinating story. Someone could do a film about her. She was from Germany as well. So I say we made the film, people who believe in the medium of film and believed in the power of the story, you know, needing to be told. Yeah.
Well, it's important. Were you able to get it onto different TV networks, or has it been played in many different festivals?
Yeah, I saw that question. So we hired a distributor in 2014, Menemsha Films in California, and it was part of a lively film festival circuit. And so in addition to film festivals, and each year it continues to be shown, it's been at schools. And now our distributor has a streaming service. I forget what it's called.
It's called HiFlix.
Oh, HiFlix, right? So people can now, because our distributor has not wanted to release it for streaming, but now through Menemsha Films, it can be streamed. We did have a agreement. Let's say Channel 13 Public PBS said they would certainly broadcast it years back, but we had to come up with the funds to have it widely seen, and we didn't have the interest really to raise more money to get it put on television. So
yeah. Well, if anyone's listening from any of those organizations, I think it's an important story that we need to tell right now, and just get it out there, the message, and to continue to inspire people. I do just want to mention, if anyone else from the audience has any other questions, please put it in the chat. So you both are working on these, you're working on health and wellness, and you've got the screenplays going on. What do you see in the future in the next couple of years for yourselves? Do you see another film that you might make together, or anything on that front, or just continue on your paths, what you're doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to, maybe one of my screenplays will get produced at some point. I have had a few things optioned, so there's hope. And I'm just going to keep working and keep writing. Yeah. I could see publishing a book in the future on one of these subjects, but and possibly another. I actually do have another documentary that I want to make about the segregation of public schools in Philadelphia, where I'm from. So that's I have the seed of that, in my mind, and so that's long term. So I might have one or two more in me.
Okay.
And I guess I see myself now as the messenger of my own message. Like, I'm teaching yoga, and I'm a musician, so I'm continuing to grow and offer my own stories and my own gifts to people, and also hope to share a memoir of my own. So,
well, that's important work, especially now. I mean, yoga and health are just so important to keep us healthy during stressful times, and whatever comes our way. Just want to ask you, do you have any final thoughts? Where should people go if they want to learn more about the film?
Well, you can go to our website, which has a little bit more about us. It has some articles. It also has a blog that we've written with several articles by both me and Rachel, by one or the other of us, or by us together. And it has some video, and it has some excerpts of some of the source material that didn't necessarily get into the film. So for people who are interested in exploring Rabbi Prince further and some of our ideas further, I think those blog posts are a really good place to look. There's also a link to an article that we wrote about Rabbi Prince in Moment magazine that tells some parts of his story that also aren't in the film. So the website is probably the best place.
Thank
And
you.
also, were you going to mention Michael Myers' book, Rachel? Or
No, I was going to mention our
Oh.
Facebook page, because our Facebook page is pretty active. Like that,
Oh, yeah.
we post there, and thank you, Hillary, for posting our website. So yeah, if people want to follow or just check out the Facebook page, that's another. And then, right, Professor Michael Meyer's book, Rebellious Rabbi, is Rabbi Prince's story mostly through Germany and a little bit of America, but.
Well, fantastic. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us tonight and for creating this film. It's important work, and we certainly appreciate it. I want to remind everybody that next week is the final discussion for this series. It's called Shared Legacies with filmmaker Sherry Rogers. So if you want more information, go to jccfilmfest.jccchicago.org/social justice series. But really appreciate everybody tuning in, asking some insightful questions, and wish you all a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks
Pleasure.
so much. Keep telling your stories.
Will do.